There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a man who has been alone too long. It is not the quiet of peace. It is not the quiet of rest. It is the kind that creeps into the corners of a house and stays there, filling up the spaces where voices used to be, where laughter used to bounce off the walls and land somewhere warm. It is the quiet of a man who has forgotten what it feels like to be expected home. Caleb Dorr knew that quiet well. He had lived inside it for 3 years by the time the letter arrived from the agency in Abilene, the one he had written to in a moment of practical desperation. Not loneliness, he told himself, that plainly practical desperation. His ranch hands were down to 2, his stove had not produced a proper meal since his housekeeper, old Miss Sutton, had gone to live with her daughter in Colorado. His land was still good. His cattle were still standing, but the man running the whole operation was running himself into the ground on cold cornbread and black coffee, and something had to change, so he wrote a letter. He asked for a cook, someone experienced with range cooking, someone who could handle a wood stove and a bunch of hungry men, someone reliable. He did not ask for company. He did not ask for conversation. He most certainly did not ask for anything that would complicate the clean, if lonely, order of his days. The letter back from the agency was brief. They had someone suited to his needs, a woman of good character, experienced in domestic work, available immediately. Her name was Nora Hale. He wrote back, "Fine, send her," and she came. But what stepped down off that stage in Cutter's Creek on a Thursday afternoon in the autumn of 1883 was not what Caleb Dorr had pictured when he imagined a ranch cook arriving at his door. It was a woman, yes. She was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or 2 younger, with dark hair pinned up under a plain bonnet and a canvas bag over one shoulder. She was calm-faced and steady-eyed, the kind of woman who looked like she had already seen the worst and decided it was survivable. And on her hip, wrapped in a worn blue blanket, was a baby. A small, dark-haired baby, awake and watching the world with enormous brown eyes, one tiny fist curled against its mother's collar. Caleb Dorr stood on the boardwalk in front of the stage office and looked at that baby for a long, silent moment, and the baby looked right back at him. Cutter's Creek was the kind of town that had almost become something and then decided not to bother. It had a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, a livery, a small schoolhouse that doubled as a meeting hall, and about 140 people who all knew each other's business better than their own. The railroad had come close but curved south, and that had sealed the town's fate as a place that endured rather than thrived. People stayed because they had roots there, or because they had nowhere else to go, or because the land itself held them the way land sometimes does, not with violence but with patience. Caleb's ranch, the Double D, sat about 4 miles east of town on a stretch of flat grassland that broke into low, rolling hills at the back. He had built the main house himself, added to it twice over the years, and it was solid and plain and did its job without pretense, which was about all Caleb asked of most things. He was 41 years old. He had brown hair going gray at the temples, hands that were permanently rough, and a face that had spent so much time outdoors it had settled into a permanent squint even indoors. He was not an unkind man, he was simply a man who had learned to keep most of himself tucked away. His wife, Clara, had died 4 years ago from a fever that took her fast and without mercy. They had not had children, which was a grief that lived below all the other griefs, the quiet one he almost never let himself look at directly. He had loved Clara steadily and without drama, the way a good rancher loves good land, gratefully, and with the constant awareness of how easily it could be taken. When he drove the wagon into Cutter's Creek that Thursday to collect his new cook, he had been mildly irritated to discover that the stage was 20 minutes late. He had stood on the boardwalk with his hat in his hands, watching the street, when Pete Coldwell, who ran the feed store, had wandered over to ask what he was waiting on. "Cook from the agency in Abilene," Caleb said. Pete nodded slowly. "That's so." The stage arrived, the dust settled. And Nora Hale stepped down with her canvas bag and her baby. And the small crowd of onlookers on the boardwalk went very quiet in that particular way that small towns go quiet when something interesting has just happened. Nora spotted him before he could compose himself. She walked straight toward him with the easy, unhurried stride of a woman who had made difficult walks before and learned not to hesitate. She stopped in front of him, shifted the baby to her other hip, and put out her hand. "Mr. Dorr, I am Nora Hale. I apologize for the stage being late." That was not something I could do anything about. He shook her hand. It was a firm handshake. He looked at the baby, then back at her. "The agency did not mention," he started. "No," she said. "I expect they did not." There was a pause. Pete Coldwell had edged slightly closer. Caleb was aware, as all small-town men are aware, that whatever he said next would be repeated before supper. He looked at the baby again. The baby had taken hold of a loose thread on its mother's collar and was examining it with profound concentration. "What is its name?" Caleb asked. "His name," Nora said with just the faintest sharpening. "His name is James. He is 7 months old." Caleb put his hat back on. "All right," he said. "Wagon is over here." He picked up her canvas bag himself before she could protest, because his mother had raised him right even if the rest of life had done its best to wear that raising away. And he walked her to the wagon without another word. Behind them, Pete Coldwell turned back toward the feed store with the satisfied expression of a man who had just been handed 3 days' worth of conversation. The drive to the ranch took about 40 minutes in good weather, and the weather that day was clear and sharp. The kind of autumn afternoon where the light comes in low and golden and makes everything look like it belongs in a painting. Nora sat on the wagon bench beside him with James on her lap, and she did not fill the silence with nervous talk, which Caleb noticed and appreciated more than he expected to. About halfway to the ranch, the baby made a small sound of displeasure, and she shifted him and murmured something soft and private to him, and he settled. Caleb watched the road. "You have done range cooking before," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes, 2 years at a sheep outfit in Kansas. Before that I cooked for a boarding house in Wichita. I know how to feed working men, and I know how to stretch a larder. I can bake, I can cure, I can put up preserves. I am not delicate about hard work, and the boy, he will not be in the way," she said. "He sleeps well and he is not a crier. I have a small crate I use for him that I can set near the stove when I am working. He will not interfere with my duties, Mr. Dorr." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I did not say he would." She glanced at him. He kept his eyes on the road. "The agency told me there would be private quarters," she said. "Small room off the kitchen. Has its own door to the outside. Me Sutton used it for years. There is a wood stove in it." He paused. "I will move the spare bed frame in from storage, give you room." She nodded. "Thank you." The ranch came into view around a gentle bend, the house, the barn, the fencing, the cattle grazing in the far field. It was not grand, but it was orderly, and Nora looked at it with a quiet, assessing eye, the way a capable person looks at a job they are already calculating how to do well. His 2 ranch hands, a wiry young man named Dill and an older Mexican cowboy named Ruiz, were at the fence when the wagon pulled up. They both looked at Nora. They both looked at the baby. Ruiz smiled immediately and broadly. Dill's face went carefully neutral. "This is Mrs. Hale," Caleb said. "She will be cooking for us starting tomorrow morning." Ruiz nodded warmly. "Welcome, Senora." He looked at the baby and made a small, gentle clicking sound with his tongue, and James stared at him with solemn interest. Caleb showed Nora to the room off the kitchen. It was small and plain, with a single window facing east, and it smelled of cedar and old wool. She stood in the middle of it with James still on her hip and looked around at it slowly, and something in her face went very still, the way a face goes still when it is trying not to show relief. "This will do fine," she said. He brought the bed frame in from storage himself that evening with Ruiz's help and said nothing else about the arrangement. The next morning he came down to find coffee already made, real coffee, the kind you could stand a spoon in, and biscuits in the oven and salt pork starting in the pan. And the kitchen smelling like a room that had remembered what it was for. He poured himself a cup. James was in his small crate near the warm side of the stove, watching the ceiling with great seriousness. Nora was working at the counter with her back to the room, and she was humming something low and tuneless. Caleb drank his coffee and did not say anything. But he stood there a moment longer than he needed to. Cutter's Creek had opinions about the situation before the week was out. It was Mrs. Aldred who started it, as she usually did, because Mrs. Aldred ran the church ladies' auxiliary and considered the moral temperature of the town to be her personal responsibility. She had been at the stage office that Thursday, and she had seen Nora Hale and her baby, and she had drawn conclusions before the dust from Caleb's wagon had even settled. The conclusions were not charitable. A woman arriving at a widower's ranch with a baby and no husband in sight spoke a language that Mrs. Aldred believed she could read fluently. She said as much to 3 women at the dry goods store on Friday, and by Sunday it had made its way through the congregation like a slow creek after rain, steady, persistent, finding every low place. Caleb was not entirely unaware of this. He heard it in the particular silence that fell when he came into the general store on Saturday for supplies. Heard it in the careful way Pastor Hicks greeted him after church and then stood there with something unasked hanging in the air between them. It was Ruiz who told him plainly, because Ruiz was a man who believed that the truth delivered kindly was still a kindness. "People in town are talking, Senor," he said one evening, leaning against the barn door. "About the woman, about the baby." Caleb was rubbing down his horse. He did not stop. "I expect they are. They are saying things that are not respectful. People who have nothing hard in their own lives always find it easy to judge the hard things in others," Caleb said. Ruiz nodded slowly. "That is true, but the woman, does she know?" Caleb had not considered that. He thought about it on the walk back to the house. He thought about Nora, who had been at the ranch 9 days now, who had not asked him for anything beyond what the work required, who made good food and kept the kitchen clean and managed James with a quiet efficiency that he found, and he would not have said this aloud to anyone, quietly impressive. He did not know her story, he had not asked. He was not by nature a man who pried, but there was a story clearly. There was a husband-shaped absence in her life that she carried with the same steady composure she carried everything else, and he had decided it was not his business. The next morning he found her alone in the kitchen before Dill and Ruiz came in for breakfast. The baby was still asleep. She was rolling out pie dough with a calm, practiced hand. He poured his coffee and stood at the table and said without preamble, "People in town are talking about you, about James." She rolled the dough once more and then straightened and looked at him. "I expected they would be," she said. "I want you to know that it does not affect your situation here." She held his gaze for a moment. Her eyes were dark brown and steady, and they did not flinch. "That is good to know," she said simply, and then she went back to her dough. He almost left it there. He was almost out of the kitchen. "Is there anything you want me to tell them?" he said. "If they ask," she was quiet for a moment. "You can tell them that James's father is dead," she said, "and that everything else is my own business." He nodded. Fair enough. He went out to start the morning work. October deepened into November, and the cold came down from the north in long, slow waves. The ranch settled into a rhythm that Caleb had not felt since Clara was alive. Not the same rhythm, not the same texture, but a rhythm nonetheless. Meals at set times, coffee always ready. The house warm and smelling of something worth coming home to. He found himself noticing things he had not expected to notice. The way Nora could tell Ruiz's coffee preference from Dill's without being asked. The way she handled James with one hand while the other stayed busy, so practiced at the doubling of tasks that she never seemed to think about it. The way she sat at the kitchen table after supper some evenings with a small book, reading by lamplight. Her feet tucked up under her on the chair in a way that was slightly informal and somehow seemed right for the room. He did not sit with her. He went to his own part of the house after supper, as was appropriate. But sometimes he stayed at the table longer than necessary, finishing his coffee. And the conversation that happened in those extra minutes was plain and quiet and about nothing in particular: the weather coming in, whether the East Field needed attention, whether she needed anything from town, and he always remembered it more clearly than he expected to. James was changing the way babies change fast when they are fed well and held often. He had started reaching for things, examining them. He had developed a particular fascination with Caleb's hat, which Caleb had discovered when he left it on the kitchen table and returned to find James stretched in his crate, straining toward it with single-minded intent. He picked up the hat and held it within James's reach. The baby grabbed the brim with both hands and pulled it close to examine it with great seriousness, and then, without any apparent reason, smiled. It was a wide, toothless, entirely sincere smile directed at Caleb, as if they had shared a joke only the two of them understood. Caleb did not smile back immediately, but then he did. Nora had been watching from across the kitchen, and she looked away before he could see her expression, but not quite fast enough. The trouble was that Caleb Dorr was not a complicated man, but he was an honest one, and honesty, when it is a habit, has a way of turning on its owner. He could not, by November's middle, pretend to himself that he was entirely indifferent to Nora Hale. He could not pretend that the house felt the same at the end of the day as it had felt before she came. And he could not pretend that the feeling was simply gratitude for good meals and a clean kitchen. But there were things that stopped him as cleanly as a fence post. She was his employee. He was her employer. There was James, whose story he did not fully know. There was Clara's memory, which he had learned to carry without letting it cripple him, but which still lived in the house, in the small framed likeness on the shelf in the sitting room, in the quilt on the spare bed, in 100 small habits of life that had formed themselves around her presence. And there was the simple, practical fear that a man who had arranged for a cook because he needed someone to feed his ranch hands had no business letting that arrangement become something it was not meant to be. He was careful, he was deliberate, he kept the proper distances, but he stopped pretending, at least to himself, that the distances did not cost him anything. The storm came in the second week of November, the first real one of the season, and it came fast. Caleb had been watching the sky since mid-morning with the experienced eye of a man who has read weather across open land for many years. And by noon he had told Dill and Ruiz to get the cattle in tight and secure the barn before it hit. The clouds came in purple-gray and low, moving with a speed that meant business. And by 2 in the afternoon the temperature had dropped 15 degrees and the wind had a bite in it that was more than wind. Dill and Ruiz made it to the bunkhouse before the worst of it came. Caleb had gone back to the main house. The storm hit at dusk. It was not a blizzard, but it was as close as autumn usually came, sleet mixed with heavy wind, the kind that drove sideways and found every gap in the walls and made the horses nervous in the barn. The house held, the stove worked. Nora had put on a pot of soup before the storm arrived, as if she had felt it coming in her bones, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of onion and salt pork. They ate supper by lamplight while the storm rattled the window glass. James slept in his room, and the house was quieter than usual, the storm outside making the indoor quiet feel closer and more deliberate. Caleb was not a man who started conversations. But they had been sitting at the table long enough, and the soup had been good, and the lamp threw a warm light across the room. And something about the completeness of the storm outside, the sense of being properly enclosed by it, loosened something in him. "You said James's father was dead," he said. She looked up from her cup. "I did not ask it as a question," he said. "I am asking it as one now you do not have to answer." She set her cup down. She did not look away from him, which he had come to understand was characteristic of her. She faced things directly. "His name was Thomas," she said. "We were not married, Mr. Dorr." He waited. "He was a good man," she said quietly. "He was not dishonest with me, I want to be clear about that. He told me he intended to marry me, we were making plans. And then he got sick, and it moved fast, and he died in the spring before James was born, and by the time I knew he was gone I was already expecting." She paused. His family did not acknowledge the situation. They had objections to me, and the situation made those objections easier to act on. I had no claim legally. So I went to Wichita and I had James and I worked, and then I wrote to the agency because I needed steadier work with accommodation included. And here I am. The wind pressed hard against the house and eased off and pressed again. His family did not take the boy, Caleb said. They did not want him, Nora said, and there was something in her voice that she controlled very carefully. Or they wanted him without me, which amounts to the same thing. I was not going to allow that. No, Caleb said, I do not imagine you would. They sat quietly for a moment. I should have told the agency the full truth, she said. I was afraid they would not send me if I did. I was afraid you would send me back when I arrived. She met his eyes. I am sorry for the deception. You told me the truth that first morning, he said, when I asked about the boy. You did not dress it up. No, that counts for something. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not quite name, not gratitude or not only gratitude. Something more careful than that. What will you do? She asked. Now that you know, he looked at his hands on the table. He thought about what Mrs. Aldred was saying in town. He thought about what was right and what was convenient, and about how those two things were sometimes the same and sometimes were not, and about which man he wanted to be when the storm cleared. Nothing different, he said. Your work is good, the boy is not a trouble, the situation is your own, as you said. He paused. But I want you to be able to stay without feeling like you are one wrong word away from the road. So I am telling you plainly, you have a place here as long as you want one. She was very still for a moment. Then she said, low and level, that is the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a long time. He picked up his cup. It is just the truth, he said. But neither of them pretended it was only practical. What followed was not sudden. Nothing between steady people ever is. Mrs. Aldred came to the ranch in late November under the pretense of bringing a church pamphlet about the winter donation drive. She arrived in the early afternoon when Caleb was out on the range and Nora was alone in the kitchen with James. The visit lasted 20 minutes. Nora told him about it that evening with the same level voice she used for everything. But her hands were very still on the table, in the way hands go still when someone is keeping themselves composed by deliberate effort. She told me I was doing a disservice to Mr. Dorr's reputation, Nora said, by being here in this state. In this state, Caleb repeated. An unmarried woman with a child of uncertain, her word, parentage, living in a widower's house. She said the town was talking and that it reflected badly on you. Caleb was quiet. She was not entirely wrong about the talking, Nora said. I do not imagine she was wrong about what they are saying either. What she was wrong about, Caleb said carefully, was coming to my house and saying those things to you instead of to me. She may say them to you as well. In her own time, she is welcome to. He looked across the table. What do you want to do? She looked surprised that he asked, as if the question had not occurred to her as a possibility. I do not know that what I want is the point, she said. It is the point to me, he said. There was a long pause. James made a small sound from his crate by the stove and Nora glanced at him and then back at Caleb. I do not want to leave, she said, quietly, as if she had not entirely meant to say it aloud. Then we will figure out what makes that possible, he said. He went to see Pastor Hicks the following week. He sat in the man's small office behind the church and said what he came to say plainly and without a great deal of preamble, which was that Mrs. Hale was a woman of good character who had been treated poorly by life and worse by gossip, and that he would take it as a personal insult if the situation was allowed to continue in the direction it was going. Pastor Hicks listened carefully, asked a few questions that Caleb answered honestly, and nodded at the end in a way that suggested he would do what he could. What changed things more than that visit, though, was a Sunday in early December when Caleb brought Nora to church. It was the first time she had been to town in any social sense since arriving. She came with James on her hip and Caleb beside her, and they walked in through the church doors and sat in the third row, which was where Caleb always sat. And the congregation around them went very quiet and then, by degrees, went on as normal. After the service, Ruiz's wife, a warm woman named Esperanza who had ridden in from their small homestead for Sunday service, introduced herself to Nora with such genuine warmth that it broke the tension of the room like a stone breaking ice. And then old Ben Priestley, who had run the livery for 30 years, shook Caleb's hand and nodded at Nora and said he had heard she made the best biscuits in the county. Which was a generous lie, but a kind one. Mrs. Aldred stood to the side and said nothing, which was, for her, a notable restraint. On the drive back to the ranch, Nora sat beside him in the cold air with James bundled against her coat, and for the first time since she had arrived. She did not look composed so much as she looked settled. "There is a difference," and Caleb noticed it. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not making me invisible." He looked at the road. He thought about Clara and about the years since Clara and about the quiet that had lived in the house like a tenant he had learned to tolerate. He thought about what it had cost him to keep everything at arm's length because arm's length felt safe. And about what it had cost Nora to hold herself together with Thomas gone and a baby to raise and a town full of people who had decided who she was before she even opened her mouth. "Nora," he said. Yes, he had not planned what came next. He was not that kind of man. "I am going to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to take it as what it is, not as something you need to answer right now or ever if you do not want to." She waited. "I did not send for a wife," he said. "I sent for a cook. I need you to know that I know the difference. And I need you to know that what I am about to say is not about the work or the house or the boy or anything practical at all." The horse walked on. The cold air moved around them. "I think very well of you," he said, "more than is entirely appropriate given the circumstances, and I am not going to act on that unless it is ever something you want. But I am done pretending it is not true, at least to myself." The silence stretched out, but it was not an empty silence. It was the kind that has weight and texture and presence. "That is a very honest thing to say," she said at last. "It is the only kind of thing I know how to say." She looked ahead at the road. After a moment she said, "I am not in a position to be hasty. I need steadiness, not urgency." "I am not asking for urgency," he said. "I have got enough to do." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was a real one, unguarded, warm. James, startled by it, looked up at his mother with delighted confusion. "All right, Mr. Dorr," she said. "Steadiness then, Caleb," he said. "I think at this point you can call me Caleb." "All right," she said again. Caleb. Winter settled full on the land, and the ranch worked through it the way ranches do, with cold hands and early mornings and the particular satisfaction of necessary labor done day after day. In hard conditions. The cattle came through, the fences held, the house stayed warm. James learned to sit up on his own in December and pull himself to standing by January, holding onto whatever was nearby, the crate, the leg of a chair, and on one memorable morning, the pant leg of Caleb Dorr, who was standing at the stove with his coffee and looked down to find himself being used as scaffolding by a determined 8-month-old who was exceedingly pleased with himself. Caleb stood very still and let him. Ruiz saw it from the doorway and said nothing, but his expression on the way out to the barn was that of a man who has seen something worth seeing. What grew between Caleb and Nora grew slowly and without drama, which was the only way either of them would have permitted it to grow. It was in the way he started staying at the kitchen table through the whole supper hour instead of retreating to the other room. It was in the way she stopped being careful about mentioning things that had happened to her before, small stories from Wichita, a funny memory of a sheep dog from the Kansas outfit. Something Thomas had once said about horses that she thought Caleb would agree with. She offered these things tentatively at first, and he received them without pressing, and over time she offered them more freely. He told her about Clara, not everything at once but by degrees. About how they had met, about what she had been like, about the grief of not having children, about how the ranch had been something they had built together even if it had been in his name. Nora listened the way she did everything steadily without filling the quiet with noise. "She sounds like she was a woman worth loving," Nora said one evening. "She was," he said. "That does not diminish. Loving someone well does not use up a person's capacity for it." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said, "I know that. I just had to get around to believing it." It was a February evening when he finally said what he had been building toward since November. The supper dishes were done. James was asleep. The house was quiet, with the good kind of quiet, the one that comes from fullness rather than absence. He had thought about it for several days, and he had thought about it the way he thought about important things, carefully and without rushing. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked up from her book. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I want to be plain about why. It is not for the town's opinion or to make the situation proper or for any reason other than that I want you here for your own sake. And the boy I want James to have," he paused. "I want to be useful to him in the way a father is useful, if you would have that." She set the book down on the table. "I am not a man who is easy to live with," he continued. "I am quiet and I am set in my ways, and I did not turn out to be a man who finds it easy to say the soft things. But I will be steady, I will be faithful. I will work hard every day for the rest of my life for whatever you and James need. That is what I have to offer." She was quiet for a long time. The lamp burned between them. Outside, the February wind moved around the house in long, slow waves. "Caleb," she said. "Yes, you have been offering all of that since the day you did not turn me away from your door." She held his gaze with those steady dark eyes. "I would be glad to marry you." He let out a slow breath. Then he said with a dry honesty that was entirely characteristic, "I was not entirely sure you would. Were you not? You are a woman who does not need anyone," he said. "I mean that as a compliment." "I know you do," she said, "but everyone needs someone. The ones who say otherwise are usually the ones who need it most." He looked at her with the sudden awareness that she had, somewhere in the course of that long winter, seen through every wall he had built around himself and decided that what was behind them was worth knowing. "That may be," he said. They were married in March in the Cutters Creek Church, on a morning when the sky was the particular clear blue that comes at the end of winter when the world is deciding to try again. Pastor Hicks read the service. Ruiz and Esperanza sat in the front row, Esperanza wiping her eyes freely and without embarrassment. Dill stood up straight in a clean shirt and looked proud of himself for remembering to comb his hair. Old Ben Priestley was there, and a few others who had, over the winter, decided that Nora Hale was a woman worth respecting. Mrs. Aldred was also there. She sat in the back and she was quiet throughout, and afterward she came forward and shook Nora's hand with a brisk nod which was not exactly warmth but was as close as Mrs. Aldred ever came to it, and Nora accepted it with the gracious steadiness that was, by now, simply her way. James rode to the church in Esperanza's arms and spent the ceremony examining the collar of her good Sunday dress with his usual intense focus. When Caleb and Nora came back down the aisle, Esperanza passed him over, and he settled against Caleb's shoulder with the easy confidence of a child who has decided a person is safe. And Caleb put one hand on his small back and held him carefully, and that was that. On the drive back to the ranch that afternoon, the three of them together on the wagon bench, Caleb looked out at the land he had worked for 15 years, the flat grassland, the hills behind. The sky going gold at the western edge, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Something that was not simply the absence of grief. Nora was watching the same horizon. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what? That room off the kitchen is going to be too small for James in another year or so." He considered this. "I could add on," he said. "Extend the east side of the house." "I was thinking the same thing," he smiled, which was something he was doing more easily of late. "How many rooms?" he said. She glanced at him sideways. "I suppose we ought to allow for a few," she said. He nodded slowly, looking forward at the road, at the ranch coming into view around the familiar bend. The house, the barn, the fences, the life that had grown up here through work and loss and patience, and now something better. I can start the plans in the spring, he said. No hurry, she said. But she was smiling too. There is a lesson folded into this story that is easy to miss if you are not looking for it. Caleb Dorr sent for a cook. He made a practical decision from a practical need, and he was prepared, as practical men are, for a practical outcome. He was not looking for anything larger. He had, in fact, spent 3 years specifically not looking for anything larger, because the larger thing had already happened to him once, and he knew what it cost when it was gone. But life has a long history of sending us what we needed instead of what we ordered. Nora Hale arrived at that stage stop with a baby on her hip and a story she had not been given permission to be ashamed of, and she faced a stranger's assessment with open eyes and steady hands. She did not ask for charity, she did not ask for more than she had come for. She did her work and she held her son and she waited, with the patience of a woman who has learned that the right kind of quiet can eventually tell you who a person really is. And somewhere in a long winter, between the coffee and the biscuits and the lamplight and the February wind, two people who had both learned to expect very little from the world looked up and found themselves, without quite planning to, seen. Not rescued, seen, which is the braver thing and the rarer one. The baby grew up on that ranch. James Dorr, he took the name when he was old enough to understand what it meant and old enough to ask for it himself, grew up knowing the smell of a barn in the early morning and the weight of a fence post and the way the light looks on flat Kansas grassland in October. He grew up knowing that his father was a man who did what was right even when it cost him something, and that his mother was a woman who did not let hardship teach her to be hard. That is not a small inheritance. So if you have ever felt like you arrived somewhere, a job, a town, a life, and it turned out not to be what was advertised, or if you have ever felt like your particular situation was the kind that earns you judgment instead of grace, remember Caleb Dorr standing on that boardwalk with his hat in his hands, looking at a woman and a baby he had not sent for. He could have turned her away, it would have been easy, it would have been legal, nobody would have blamed him, but he picked up her bag, and in the end, that was the whole story. Thank you for spending this time with us here at Rusted Saddle Stories. If this story settled into you somewhere quiet, the way the good ones do, we hope you will share it with someone who might need to hear it today. We have got plenty more waiting for you, each one a different trail through the same country, the country of people trying to do right by each other under a wide, honest sky. Until next time, friends, keep writing.